I'm greatly honored to introduce Professor Dennis Goldberg this evening. It's especially appropriate that he be here to deliver this lecture honoring Rhodes Scholar Bram Fischer. Of course, Dennis was charged and convicted in the Rivonia trial, where Bram Fischer was the lead defense attorney. And of course, not long after, he was also imprisoned in the same place. Professor Goldberg and Bram Fischer knew each other very well. In fact, were close friends. I hardly need to introduce Professor Goldberg. At age 21, at only 21, he was already a member of the Congress of Democrats in the ANC-led Congress Alliance, and he was still a young man when charged in the Rivonia trial. He was sentenced to 4 life terms and served 22 years, and later became the ANC representative in London until the end of apartheid came. He has been a tireless campaigner for social justice in South Africa and beyond, and has many notable achievements, and I won't attempt to say them all, but one of those is the establishment of HEART, Health Education and Reconstruction Training, which has done remarkable things across South Africa and elsewhere. I think I won't do much more introduction than that, but welcome to Rhodes House, and go on. Many other awards, and it is a great honor to have you here tonight, sir.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. I'm going to sit down because I have a bad hip, and standing doesn't do me any good. I would have liked to have stood up to show you my African doctoral gown. Thought I'd bring a bit of fashion to Oxford, you know? Medical University of Southern Africa, Mudunza. I did tell the students who were graduating that they'd had to work hard and sit exams for their degrees. I just sat for 22 years and got mine. I also promised them I wouldn't do any brain surgery. Warden, thank you for inviting me to come to Rhodes House, and also thanks to the Africa Studies Centre to speak about Bram Fischer, Rhodes Scholar, who played such an important part in liberating South Africa from the apartheid system, which was such a blight on our land and our people. At the outset, I have to tell you that I'm a fan of Bram. I admired him. He was a comrade freedom fighter against the horrific tyranny and exploitation of the institutionalized system of apartheid racism by law. He was a friend, a fellow prisoner in an apartheid prison for 9 years until he died. I nursed him. I loved him for his utter humanity, for his gentleness and for his toughness. He had a backbone of tempered steel. Within my own limitations, I try to uphold the legacy of striving for a world in which human beings can achieve their potential instead of being stunted in their physical, mental, intellectual, psychological, or spiritual capacities. Bram would have argued that spiritual was not an appropriate word in the vocabulary of a committed philosophical realist, a Marxist and a communist. But his concern for people en masse and as individuals make him in a certain sense spiritual, because like all real Marxists, our thinking about human beings starts from the intangible nature of people and the moral grounds for believing in the inherent right to be human. Raymond Williams, the son of a Welsh miner who became a foremost student of English literature, traces the 400-year-old revolution for equal rights for all that had a noteworthy moment when a momentarily unified English people beheaded King Charles I. I'm sure you will remember the poetic fragment from even earlier, from the Peasant Revolt of 1381. Hey, you know, it pays to go to prison. You get time to read and find out history. The poetic fragment from the Peasant Revolt of 1381, which went, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who then was the gentleman?" Clearly, that was a wish to return to a classless society, that we have yet to achieve. Maybe those who knew Bram will recognize the person in some of the characteristics I saw in him. A man whose clarity of purpose was so striking, but like most of us was complex and lived a life of great contradictions. He was a family man who worked hard at it, but was often not there for his family because of his professional work and his political activism for his larger family of all humankind. He was a committed communist who is credited with resolving legal issues of mining rights, which enabled the mining capitalists to profitably mine gold from ultra-deep levels. He also devised a legal tax avoidance scheme for the richest of the rich mine owners to pay no income tax, but for their estates to pay capital gains tax of a paltry 11% on their personal wealth when they died. I must admit I'm grateful to him because when my dad was destitute in his old age, he humiliatingly turned to the Jewish Board of Deputies, which lent him a few hundred rands a month to survive on. Of course, the loans were to be repaid, but he died destitute while I was still in prison, and his tax-free loans were never repaid. Bram rejected all ideas of national chauvinism because of our South African experience of a racist system designed to create cheap labour, resulting in poverty and denial of human dignity. But he was deeply concerned about the future of the Afrikaner people, asking, what shall we do with my arme mense, my poor people? He was a committed anti-imperialist because of the British oppression of the Afrikaner people. Yet strove to become a Rhodes Scholar while rejecting Rhodes's imperialist politics and the rape of people and resources of our land and indeed of Africa. As a 6-year-old at home at the time of the uprising of General Joubert and others, he was playing with his tin soldiers. And because his parents were involved with the people who had been arrested, British officers visited the family home, saw him playing with his tin soldiers and said, "And so what are you doing?" He said, "The Boers are killing the khakis." Khakis were the British soldiers because of their uniforms. You do have to teach 6-year-olds in a revolutionary household to learn to hold their tongues, you know. But I have to tell you also that Bram, with all his positive attributes, was quite determinedly modest. He really played down his own role. He never pushed himself forward. But you always had to discuss with Bram. Somehow it was important to talk to him. But this striving for his Rhodes Scholarship, you have to say, what an ambitious young man he must have been. Yet many have said that had he remained true to the folk, he would have been Prime Minister of apartheid South Africa. But he set aside his personal ambition to serve a more abstract but burning need for justice for all people. He grew up in a white supremacist Afrikaner family, but rejected those ideas, and yet never rejected his family. He became a committed anti-racist. Stephen earlier described him playing with black kids and saying later when he had to shake hands with students of his own age at college, how was it possible that he found it embarrassing because the kids hadn't changed, he had changed. Being polite, he did shake hands, but puzzled over his embarrassment. He realized, he said, that it was he who had changed, not young black people, and realized there was no real material basis for this shift in his thinking. He had been taught by his society to be a racist, and therefore could unlearn it as well. As an officer of the court, he was sworn to uphold the laws of the apartheid state, but as a revolutionary, he used the courts to further the revolutionary overthrow of the system. I believe that we solve the logical gap between what is in society and what our morality tells us it ought to be through social action. He said in his speech from the dock during his trial, ultimately, that when the law is immoral, one must obey a higher law in the interest of justice, clearly drawing a distinction between justice and decisions of courts established to preserve the state. Bram was also an enormously talented athlete, playing against a touring New Zealand rugby team while he was still a student in the 1930s. Physically small, he was hard as nails. He was also a great tennis player with a vicious high-kicking serve, with a crafty cross-court drop shot from close to the net. He was highly regarded in mining and business circles and is still regarded as one of the greatest liberation lawyers. As it's been said, he was born into an elite family, and I met him for the first time in the early 1960s when I was in Johannesburg on an advanced highway design course. His elder daughter Ruth invited me home for Sunday lunch, where I met Bram in a setting of informal pre-lunch chit-chat. It was clear that people simply dropped in, not needing an invitation to visit. Conversation flowed all round the top political topics of the time. National and international affairs were intermingled. Personalities and gossip seemed to mix frothily over the surface of Sunday at leisure. My own engineering work seemed of interest, but I think out of politeness to a visitor. Bram was clearly the centre of it all, with his wife Molly being a little off-centre as she wandered in and out, making sure that the entertainment and lunch flowed as smoothly as the conversation. The deference with which Bram's remarks were received and his unassuming manner was striking. He seemed to twinkle. The next time we met was in October 1963. I'd been arrested with others at Lily's Leaf Farm in Rivonia on the outskirts of Joburg. We'd been detained under the 90 days detention law designed to give the police the power to hold a prisoner indefinitely until they had the information they wanted. It was a license to torture. Now that awful period was over and we had been released and immediately rearrested under the Sabotage Act, not knowing exactly what we were charged with. Nelson Mandela already serving a 5-year sentence, Walter Sisulu, Govan Mbeki, Raymond Mhlaba, Ahmed Kathrada, Rusty Bernstein, Andrew Mlangeni, Elias Matsaledi, James Cantor, and Bob Heppel and I were brought together in a room where we met our lawyers. Bram was the leader of our defence team. George Bezos, Joel Joffe, and Arthur Chaskelson were there. Later, Vernon Beringer joined the team. Since Joel, now Lord Joffe, is here with Lady Joffe, I have the opportunity to thank them for cancelling their planned emigration to Australia to stay to defend us, because no other lawyers would. And then many others were defended over a number of years. I've written that what that brave couple showed is that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary deeds when the need arises and conscience and a sense of justice prevail. Thank you, dear Joel and Vanetta. Bram was very quiet and still, which was his usual manner. He must have been very worried about us all, we were comrades, because the Sabotage Act not only required a minimum sentence of 5 years on conviction, it specifically allowed the death sentence. But there was more to it than that. He was himself directly involved in our underground activities. And though he didn't let on at all, he must have been deeply concerned that some of the witnesses arrested at the farm would have seen him and so could identify him. Throughout the trial, Bram was striking for his seriousness and determination. He had the ability to concentrate fiercely, even in the bleak office set aside in the prison for consultations. That room was surely wired for sound, bugged, as we would say. His very fair skin seemed thin. One could see the blood close beneath the skin. Sometimes his face would be suffused with a pink blush when he was annoyed. But when he was angered or forced to be silent, Bram's face would be drained of blood, his lips squeezed in a tight, bloodless line. His blue eyes would flash until he hid them behind partly closed lids, or he would tip his head down to hide his feelings. Throughout the time I knew him, then and later for 9 long years in prison, he always hid his emotions until you understood that his stillness was the expression of the depth of his feelings. He used language beautifully and precisely in both English and Afrikaans. During our trial, he hardly ever swore, but on one occasion he singled me out to chat while the other lawyers and my co-accused were busy. He asked me how I felt about our situation, and I said that I was convinced that apartheid, for all its seeming strength, was living on borrowed time. This was 1963, by the way. Was living on borrowed time. His response, "We'll get the bastards yet, won't we?" And the rarity of the swear word made it a powerful expression of his determination and the rigidity of his very strong backbone. Later, I realized he'd been asking me how I felt about our trial. Such a strong case had been made against us, but that seemed to me in some way irrelevant. Our future was more bound up in the politics of South Africa than in some isolated concept of law and justice or injustice. Bram, throughout the trial, generated energy and ideas as he fought to save our lives with his colleagues. He was meticulous in his preparations and once told me that a basic guideline in cross-examination was not to ask a hostile witness a question to which you did not know the answer, because the answer could be turned against you. Our defense strategy was to show that even though there had been such much discussion about Operation Maibuya, a document, the name means Operation Come Back, as in Maibuya Africa, Come Back Africa. No date had been set for starting guerrilla warfare. In that sense, even the investigations I had made, into making weapons, landmines, grenades, detonators, were all part of a thorough, responsible study made by serious people. There really was a dispute about whether Operation Maibuya had been adopted or not. But despite that, Joe Slovo had already left the country to make arrangements for international support for weapons supply and military training facilities. The state wanted a show trial, and we had to show them. We had to turn it around to show that it was the apartheid state that was the source of violence and brutality. In other words, we had to demonstrate the state terrorism. Bram, the activist, showed enormous courage by appearing in court in the Rivonia trial. He avoided appearing in court during the first few days when the farm labourers were called to give evidence. But 2 state witnesses, Patrick Mtembu and Bartholomew Schlepane, both members of the SACP and of Umkhonto we Sizwe, knew Bram in both capacities and could have betrayed him, but did not. It was striking that state witnesses would acknowledge their membership of the ANC and of Umkhonto we Sizwe, the spear of the nation, but would conceal their membership of the Communist Party. In Cold War times, that was fairly natural self-preservation. The government and security police hated communists as the cause of all their problems. I said I was not a member of the Communist Party and was apparently in very good company because Nelson Mandela also denied that he was a member. It is an oddity of our history that it was okay to hold foreign ideologies that supported apartheid, but ideologies of the left were, for some, and for some still are, reprehensible. We even have a noted former newspaper editor who says he has no ideology because he is a liberal, meaning that as long as things stay as they are, all will be peaceful, I suppose. On this theme, Martin Plaut, a former BBC news editor, wrote recently in the New Statesman that even if Nelson Mandela was a member of the Communist Party, we should be grateful for that influence because the Communist Party insisted on a non-racial future, which is what the ANC-led government insisted would be the basis of our new constitution. We know, too, that the communist Afrikaner, Bram Fischer, was influential in weaning Nelson Mandela and many others away from the belief that Afrikaners are automatically racists. But back to Bram in the trial, who quite cold-bloodedly said that he felt he was safe from arrest for as long as the trial continued, His arrest would have triggered even more international criticism of the trial, for the implication that a proper legal defense was impossible. He was right. Shortly after the trial, he was charged with others with the membership of the illegal Communist Party. He was given bail to plead a commercial case before the British House of Lords. He said he would return to stand trial and did so, despite his exiled comrades urging him to stay abroad. And having come back, he then jumped bail and went underground to try our political structures that have been shattered by the Lilies Leaf arrests and many others all around the country. Yes, he'd given his word. Yes, he was a South African. Yes, he was a patriot. But the driving force was to continue the struggle for a revolution. That was his purpose. Prior to sentencing, my comrades insisted they would not appeal against a death sentence if it was imposed. And it was widely expected and called for by the prosecution and the mainstream white media. Bram said he would insist on an appeal against death sentences because the length of time that would take would allow tempers to cool and also give time for other governments to exercise pressure to stop the executions. Indeed, the United Nations General Assembly had overwhelmingly voted to stop the trial. I agreed with Bram, not just because I wanted to live, but the loss of my comrades who had become such great leaders over the past 20 years would have been a political tragedy for our future when we would need to rebuild our society. We were absolutely sure we were going to rebuild our society one day. The Rivonia trial ended with us being sentenced variously to 1 to 4 life sentences, and our team, led by Bram, had, I believe, literally saved our lives. It sure is nice to report to you about it tonight. Bram visited my comrades on Robben Island together with Joel Joffe to discuss an appeal against the life sentences. It was deemed too risky because the appeal court might say we were lucky not to be sentenced to death. They would have put it more elegantly. Bram stoically did not tell them that Molly, his beloved wife and comrade to all of us, had died in a motor accident. He simply would not impose his grief on others. When Bram and Joel visited me in Pretoria prison, I was white. I wasn't on Robben Island. I was in an apartheid prison, a white prison. I had been told with a sense of shock and commiseration by a prison general about Molly's passing. I took Bram's hand to express my sympathy. He simply hid his face, willing the tears not to fall, and would not talk about it. Bram had indicated previously that his intention was to go underground. I devised a book code for him while we were on trial. I too was prepared to use the courts to further the revolution. Based on the Bible, which was a legitimate book to find in even poor homes, it served very well until one of his confidants was broken under interrogation. Bram, as you've heard, survived for 9 months until arrested and charged. And then he was sentenced to life imprisonment plus 3 terms of 8 years to run consecutively. You know, he got 8 years for forging a driving license, if you can believe that. Later, in prison with a comrade who had been broken and given up where he was to be found, Bram never once berated this comrade. He would not hurt anybody, not deliberately. I have to say that Bram, in his professional life before prison, was a very dapper dresser in his suit and well-shaped hat, with his briefcase under his arm. But in prison, he kind of reveled in wearing a pair of too big for him khaki shorts, shoes without laces, an old felt hat, kind of conical shaped because it was so old, as he potted about in our garden. Imagine a hot, hot summer's day, Bram with his watering can, tending seed trays in the shadow of a high wall, the fair skin of his chest and back burnt bright pink by the sun. The head of our prison had been a ganger working on the roads as a labourer, under what was called the civilized labor policy to employ whites and not blacks in the hungry 1930s and 40s. This captain was enormously proud of being a Boer nationalist and ardent supporter of apartheid. He remarked to me, "Kyk die ou stasiemeester, look at the old station master." It was said with quiet affection as he referred to the government-owned railway system running station garden competitions in those years to generate a bit of pride in their people. But it was so contradictory because the authorities sometimes showed their deep-seated hatred for one of their finest elders, who in their eyes was a traitor to the Afrikaner people, or the Boere as they then liked to call themselves. Now if you use the word Boere, they say that's racist, we're attacking them. Bram, over the years, would seek evidence of a shift of attitudes on race issues among his people. The poet Antjie Krog, as a student, wrote some wonderful poetry about the future, and she delighted him, as did Ingrid Jonker, whose poem The Child Is Not Dead, about a baby shot by a policeman, a black baby shot by a policeman, said that its life would live in our memory of the brutality of the system. And though Bram seldom swore, as I've described, in prison he would sometimes unleash a vocabulary that made me envious, and especially because of the elegant accent with which he cursed the brutality of the system and its Western international backers. Bram loved music. I want to give you a picture of this whole man. He wasn't just a political activist. Bram loved music, and we were allowed to buy records, those old 33 1/3 things. But he could not stand music playing loudly when he was working, thinking, reading, or writing. Classical music he loved. Formal jazz, that of Dave Brubeck, for example, he thought was good. He liked the complexity of the music and its rhythms. It was also planned and coherent like a symphony, written down, meaning that it had been carefully composed. Jam sessions, and therefore by definition spontaneous music making, he thought was self-indulgent and lacking in meaning because it was not composed. Of course it was composed. It was instantaneous composition of variations on the theme leading to totally new musical expression. Beethoven's variations on a theme, or Bartók's variations for that matter, were legitimate because they were pre-planned, and serious jazz, which would take a simple pop melody as the basis for variations of increasing complexity and a variety of moods and expressions, he thought was fine. He found rock music cacophonous. I agreed with him about that, but I found that some rock music had a complexity that made repeated hearing a pleasure, because there was always something new in it, unlike most pop music, which did not stand up to repeated hearing. The Beatles and the Stones were fabulous for their interesting lyrics and the way in which the melody matched the meaning of the songs. The Stones in particular had a large range of sounds and moods, which far transcended the noise of some other groups, who seemed to adopt the same energy levels and sounds, but somehow did not match them for sustained development. And Bram loved African rhythms and drum music, but found jazz drumming decadent, probably because it was American and therefore suspect. But also, I think it was because the limited tonal range of African percussion music seemed to be designed to provide rhythms for dance, and especially ritual dance, and therefore had an internal consistency. And likewise, Bram thought the scat singing of Ella Fitzgerald was meaningless, childish noise, because it was singing that did not use words to give meaning. But the making of voice music by operatic singers who sing sounds which, though they start from the lyrics, were often voice music divorced from any words, was superb, he said. It was easy to agree about the latter, and just as easy to argue heatedly about the former. Bram never stopped thinking politics. We saw a report in a smuggled piece of newspaper. We had no access to news for 16 years. until Sidney Kentridge, who's here, led a case for us all the way to the appeal court for access to news, the right to access news. We lost, but we got the newspapers. Thanks, Sidney. We saw a report of a Soviet Kirov-class cruiser and its escort vessel sailing through the Malacca Straits under the noses of the assembled heads of Commonwealth governments meeting in Singapore. The news item reported a frisson of disquiet. The Soviet Admiral Gorshakov's Blue Water Fleet was too much for them. Within a matter of days, Bram had the outline of a strategy which would change the balance of power in the Indian Ocean, and therefore the possibilities of liberation for countries on the eastern seaboard of the whole African continent. First Hugh Lowen and then Fred Carnison memorized the final version, and when they were released, Bram's strategy was passed on through the Communist Party to colleagues in the Soviet Union. Bram's vision was truly international and comprehensive. I can also tell you Bram was awarded the Lenin Peace Prize by the Soviet Union, but did not tell us about it. Hugh Lowen's visitor informed him, and so we knew about this honor. It's a funny thing about revolutionaries getting peace prizes, eh? I must tell you, the Mahatma Gandhi Foundation in Durban has given me the Gandhi Satyagraha Peace Prize because I fought for human rights. And the Dalai Lama's representative was present and said, "Congratulations, we know that you were the arms maker, but you fought for human rights, and so we support this award." Just to tell you that we can also do intellectual somersaults. As with attitudes and opinions, Bram seldom allowed himself to show physical or emotional pain. He suppressed physical pain so that he could play sports. Early on, shortly after he was sentenced, we were playing bucket ball, a primitive kind of basketball. It was played with a tennis ball that had to be thrown into a bucket, balanced on a stool, balanced on a small table. This supposedly non-contact sport was intensely physical. David Evans once flipped out his arm to send me crashing into a brick wall. The impact seemed to put my own elbow through my ribs. Hugh dribbled the ball around Bram in fine basketball style, only to be harried by him. Hugh tucked the ball under his arm like a rugby player and gave Bram a rough handoff. Undeterred, this is played on concrete, by the way. Undeterred, Bram reverted to his provincial rugby playing days of 40 years earlier. He grabbed Hugh's outstretched hand, swung his feet up under Hugh's armpit, and with a superb maneuver, judo threw him to the ground. Bram rolled out over his shoulder to stand up. Hugh got up much more slowly as he struggled to get back his breath. And Comrade Bram had a twinkling sense of fun. Christmas parties were his specialty. The first time we made our own meal from saved up tins of spaghetti and meatballs. You know spaghetti and meatballs, the meatballs so little, but it was so exciting. Green peas, canned peaches with ideal milk and the like. His contribution to the fun was to read with great enjoyment from the Mad Hatter's Tea Party from Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. He had us in fits of laughter. By 1974, Bram was frequently ill. He needed a cataract operation. His hip became more uncomfortably sore with what he thought was arthritis. His digestion was bad, and he was beginning to look gaunt and frail. Marius Kuhn pressed on me the need for us to urge Bram to insist that the prison doctor refer him to the necessary specialists to find the causes of his various ailments. Together we spoke to Bram, with Marius explaining our concern. Bram, as usual, denied the need for such bold measures. His health was not bad, he said, and I'm sure what disconcerted him the most was that we had seen through his attempts to conceal his bouts of ill health. Finally, Bram agreed to do it. I kept a diary of Bram Fischer's medical treatment because it seemed to me that he was not being properly treated, and I wanted a factual contemporary record on which to base a complaint to the authorities. If there was no response, I hoped that I would be able to get people outside the prison to use it. as ammunition against the callous attitude of the prisons department. Bram died of cancer while still a prisoner. People say he was released from prison. He wasn't. He was released to his brother's home, which was declared to be a prison under the control of the prison authorities, who visited there every day and controlled every person who came to visit him. He was taken to his brother's house in Bloemfontein, yet it was a privilege. It was a privilege, but the whole process was terribly lacking in compassion, despite the minister's promise that he could be released to his daughter's home in Johannesburg. Bram was cremated by the prison authorities, and they refused to give his ashes to his daughters. I'm sure that they feared the ashes would become a shrine for those in the struggle. And I can tell you that when Molly Fischer died and was cremated, people poured out to her funeral. People who were banned, people for whom it was illegal to come together, simply did so, and the police did not intervene. The saga of Bram's last days had a sequel for me. After he had been taken away from our prison, I asked my dad to send him a telegram of birthday greetings from us all in April 1975. Some weeks later, after Bram had died, I was called to see a captain in the prison service. He was an Irishman who had served in the British Army. He had later joined the prison service in 7 former British colonies in Africa. Moving from one to the other as each became independent. He was ruthless and rather enjoyed having a go at me, because I once complained to the Minister of Prisons, the notorious Jimmy Kruger, about his behaviour. The captain demanded to know how I dared to go outside of channels to complain about him. After all, the minister is officially the head of the prison service, yet for that sadist, that was going outside of channels. Clearly he'd been chastised. He told me he would get me and would break no rules in the process. Now he was going to get me for communicating with a prisoner without permission from the Commissioner of Prisons. The captain assured me he was serious. They had a recording of the words I had asked my dad to put in the telegram, and the telegram contained those words. The telegram was illegal and had been confiscated and not given to Bram. What sort of a person are you, I demanded, that you stop a birthday greeting to a man who's been with us for 9 years and now dying? His response was that he had warned me and now he had me. At last I would be convicted of a prison offence. Of course, I demanded the right to see a lawyer to defend me. Then I gave him a lecture about inhumanity, ending with a peroration about the need for Nuremberg-style trials of officials who had been complicit in the inhumanity of apartheid. It ended with me spinning about and storming out of the room. Damn, I was in a prison and the door was locked. Nevertheless, it was a great performance, even if I was the only one to enjoy it. No charge was brought against me, and I like to think that his superiors saw the potential embarrassment that might come from such a charge. The Irish British Army officer who had become a prison officer was posted to another prison. We saw him only once again for a short time. And I wonder if he was just a man who liked to be in uniform, or was that a cover for another trade? Was he an undercover agent? I have to say Bram's fate was the result of systematic negligence in the prison medical service. And all of us in that prison experienced the same treatment for a variety of reasons. What about Bram today? We know more about him because of an excellent documentary film directed by Sharon Farr, who had access to the family archives. We have Stephen Klingman's biography, and some of you heard Stephen speaking earlier, and others too, and much to read on the internet and what others have written in their biographies and autobiographies. Joel Joffe's The State versus Mandela is a lawyerly account of the trial and Bram's role in it. Ken Brown, an American lawyer, academic, saving Mandela, is also a lawyer's analysis of the trial. Honoured by Stellenbosch University, the home of allegedly enlightened Afrikaner nationalism, with a posthumous doctorate, Bram appears to have been brought in from the cold. But Yvonne Milan, where are you, Yvonne? Over here. The promoter of this ward was beaten up by Afrikaner students who are still verkrampters, reactionaries, who would like to go back to the apartheid racism. They didn't just beat her up, they broke some of her ribs, these brave heroes. President Mandela delivered the first Bram Fischer Memorial Lecture in Johannesburg, sponsored by the Legal Resources Centre. Would Bram be satisfied with what has been achieved? I believe he would be pleased by our great constitution, but would be striving for better implementation of policies to overcome the many legacies of apartheid. He would be appalled by the profligate spending of state resources for personal enrichment. He had said ministers should not have cars bigger than a Volkswagen Beetle. He objected to the Wabenzi cult. He could be rest assured they're all driving BMW 7 Series. He would want more intervention to improve the living conditions of working people and to curb the high salaries and perk of top earners in government and the private sector. But he would laud the progress that has been made and want more and much more rapidly. Nikolai Ostrovsky's eulogy for a communist comrade in his novel, How the Steel Was Tempered, could have been written for Bram. Man's dearest possession is life. It is given to him but once, and he must live it so as to feel no torturing regrets for wasted years, never knowing the burning shame of a mean and petty past. So live that dying he might say, all my life, all my strength were given to the finest cause in all the world, the fight for the liberation of mankind. There's a similar passage in a speech by the progressive liberal American judge Oliver Wendell Holmes, who said, when we were young, our hearts were touched with fire. And he continues, as life is action and passion, it is required of a man that he should share the passion and actions of his time, at the peril of being judged not to have lived. Bram Fischer lived. I'm convinced his spirit will live on and on. I thank you for ensuring that the series of Bram Fischer Memorial Lectures will continue. Thank you. Thank you. Let's not waste time.